Right, so greetings, hello, welcome to the Philosophy Club here in little Patette in the middle of the heart of Old Gaul in France. And we're just neighbouring to Auvergne, the other province nearby. We discovered this week that yesterday was the Saint's Day of Saint Reine, a French saint I'd not heard of. Yesterday is her feast day, and she was from Alasia, which is where Vercingetorix was finally defeated by Caesar's sneaky generalship and captured and taken to Rome. But anyway, so it's interesting, she was a saint in around 286 AD, resisting the advances of the then governor of Gaul, which was ruled from Lyon, by the way. Most people don't realise Paris was a village. Lyon was a city dedicated to Lu, the god of light for the ancient Celts. And Claudius, the emperor, was born there. So, yeah, they're not too far away here. One of my neighbours lives in Lyon and comes to this village for the summer holidays. And Lyon's a beautiful city if you've not been there. So anyway, we honour Saint Reine and today's saints as well. And sages. So, yeah, so my little report back on the week. Well, what have we been up to here? It's been quite a... It's got that sort of end of summer feel. The weather gets colder, the rain starts. We had absolute 24 hours of downpour, drenched rain. Monsoon season hit. And all night, and half the next day. Which is quite fun when that happens, because the summer gets very, very hot here. Because doesn't do things in moderation. It goes either really, really hot or really, really, really cold and wet. And it seems to go, flip. When I did geography at school, this was called the continental climate, those extremes. So we've got a continental climate here. But, it's got once you adjust, it's quite beautiful. So this week I've had a meeting of the World Peace Gardens Network, which I'm focalising on behalf of my friend, the late Geoffrey Gale, and it's a network of peace gardens. It's a symbolic thing. We have a website. If you have a garden and you like my talks and like the idea of philosophizing in a garden, then please get in touch and we can enroll your garden in our network of peace gardens. It was Epicurus who taught in a garden in Athens, one of the great Greek philosophers who felt philosophizing should happen in a garden. And I think that Aristotle and Plato agreed. Plato, in the academy, basically it was a garden, it was a forest grove. I've been there in Athens, and it's a beautiful site. Now it's a park. I'd like to get that declared a World Peace Garden. I think that would be appropriate. And so friends of mine have just been in Venice at an event where there may be a World Peace Garden. Geoffrey always wanted one in Venice. So it's been it's been a busy week, and I'm writing very, very busily. I've got a deadline to finish by Christmas, my 1,000-page 2-volume book called The 99 Names of Peace. I've mentioned this a bit. Every day I'm writing for several hours. And each chapter has a language, and some of them are, common languages like Spanish, French, Chinese, Mandarin, whatever. And then some are obscure. So we've had Malayalam, Finnish, an Australian Aboriginal language, Armenian, Azeri, Hawaiian. And what I do each time is go into the history of the language and I explore its vocabulary for peace. What are its words for peace, conflict resolution? But related words, philosophically, like truth, justice, love. And it's always very interesting. I've done Balinese, Vietnamese, Cambodian, and Thai. And every time I do a chapter, I fall in love with the culture, the people, and the language. Thai, I'm absolutely in love with these people. They're amazing. I used to love going to the Thai Buddhist temple in Wimbledon, in London, when I lived there. Beautiful murals on the wall, colourfully dressed people. Deep Buddhists, but with a kind of light touch. And fascinating, the Thai Buddhist tradition. So I've been exploring the history of all that, how the capital comes to be in Bangkok. It used to be 50 miles inland, and there was a tremendous Thai civilization for 500 years there with very advanced literature. Because in each language I look at the literature, if there is one, and I give a summary of that. And the Thai literature was very advanced. It was, metaphysics, Buddhist style, but also novels and poetry, epic poetry. The Thai court, it was a monarchy of course, Buddhist monarchy, encouraged an aristocratic circle to write poems. And they did epics, like 20,000 verses. And one of them was a great, around the time of Napoleon, a Thai intellectual in the court he was on the fringes of the court. He actually fell out of favour and he spent time in prison. And it was in prison he began this national epic of the Thai people, which he was a sort of Byron figure. And it's an adventure story of the seven seas, pirates, lovers coming and going, supernatural beings. He's in love with a goddess, etc., etc. It's like an epic, and the Thai people love this. They've been reading it ever since for the last 200 years, and it's what kids learn, to understand their culture. So very sophisticated literature in Thailand. I also did Cambodian language, which is close to Thai in some respects. And I researched the tragic genocide of the Khmer Rouge and the killing of somewhere between 1.5 and 2 million people. And also I was researching the intellectual origins of this. Why did this happen? These were Marxists, but there's nothing in Marx about mass slaughtering intellectuals. And I found a film by a British scholar who was a journalist actually for the BBC, and who researched the history of Pol Pot in great detail. And he actually met him once in Beijing. He was a BBC journalist. And he gives this brilliant lecture to the Los Angeles University of California Center for Southeast Asian Studies. It was recorded a while ago. You can watch it on C-SPAN. It's on my YouTube. It's on my Facebook page. This is an hour-and-a-half lecture, and the question is, why did Pol Pot do the genocide? And he goes into the psychological history of this guy. I learned all kinds of stuff I didn't know. Like Pol Pot's mother was a courtesan in the royal court, one of the aristocrats, which is what got him acceptability to begin with. Pol Pot, as a young man, was kind of, okay as far as the establishment was concerned. His name, Pol Pot, came from his study time in Paris. And this talk goes into when he came to Paris. He fell in with a bunch of Marxist Communist Party members. He joined the Communist Party. And they were all like urban intellectuals. They wanted to reform society according to the works of not just Marx, but also Stalin, who they were all followers of. This was the 1950s. And also Mao, they were reading Mao. So Pol Pot was studying Marx interpreted through Mao and Stalin. And they were both pretty ruthless and pretty unethical, in my view, these two, in my opinion, they took Marxism in an entirely wrong direction. And Marx would be turning in his grave to know what had been done in his name. But Pol Pot and co, there was a little cadre came out to Paris. They went back determined to transplant these ideas into this basically rural civilization which had survived for centuries with a kind of aristocratic court and a largely urban elite, but then a peasant class who were quite happy doing their thing. They were poor, but they didn't really know it. They were like, if you want, French peasants in the Middle Ages. Anyway, the lecture goes into it and explains in detail. And what they did. Oh, by the way, he took his name, Pol Pot, from a French phrase, politique potentielle. It means the potential of politics to make changes. It was a French slogan he adopted. And Okay, so he goes back to, with his training now, and he joins the Communist Party in Cambodia. He creates a secret elite, and he's the most secretive politician that's ever existed on the planet, according to the BBC journalist Philip Short, who wrote Pol Pot, Anatomy of a Nightmare, which is a full-length biography I've got on order. And he never did press interviews, he never did anything. He communicated with his Communist Party cadres in secret by handwritten letters. They didn't do radios, nothing. They wanted to stay off-grid. And they were plotting a serious revolution, not a pretend one, not a kind of bourgeois revolution, but a to the death, kill them off type revolution. And eventually, because of the tragedy of the Vietnam War that was going on at the same time, they were able to seize power. And when the Cambodian Communist Party marched into Phnom Penh, the capital, within, I think it was 3 days, says Philip Short, they sent everyone out of the capital city. This was a city the size of Los Angeles in terms of population, about 2 or 3 million. They literally banished everyone to the countryside. They'd pre-planned this. And they were given like a few hours to collect any belongings they could carry with them. Everything else had to stay behind. You weren't allowed to take anything, mind-boggling. And so there were these columns for days of all the population of Phnom Penh marching into the countryside, just carrying what they could. Those who were too ill and old to travel, this guy did his research. He interviewed some of the people, the soldiers of the Communist Party who forced them out. He said, what happened with the old ones? Did you leave them? What happened? No, we killed them. Who ordered that? Why did you just kill them? You killed off the old people and the sick people? Yes, we killed them. Did anyone order that? No, we just did it ourselves. We decided that was what had to be done. So what he's studying is how can people behave in such an evil way? These people were brainwashed into thinking it's for the progress of humanity is to force urban people into the countryside to live like peasants. And the other thing he points out is this revolution was made by peasants for peasants. The army of the Communist Party of Pol Pot was a peasant army who hated urban people. They hated intellectuals. They hated anyone that wasn't, a rural peasant type. And so they were very happy to herd them into the countryside. A lot of them died on the march, and then more died of starvation once they were in the countryside. And over the next several years, and the next thing they did, day one, they abolished money. Pol Pot's regime declared all money was worthless. So if you had savings in a bank, or you had money under a mattress, or you had money in a purse, all of that was now meaningless. So what this meant, according to Philip, is that to eat, you had to be chums with the Communist Party cadres, because only they had food. You couldn't go into a shop and buy food anymore. There were no shops. And the only food was in the hand of the Communist Party, and everything. The economy completely vanished because there was no money. And so it was all controlled by the Communist Party under Pol Pot, who then decided who would eat or not. And if you shirked your work, or you weren't doing your digging properly, let's say you were kind of a poet and you didn't know how to do gardening, well, you weren't given any food, and you died off. And within a few years, so it's very interesting to hear what happens if a state abolishes money. I suppose they did it thinking, well, we're against capitalism, so we're going to abolish all capital money. But what happened was a catastrophe. I've always quite liked money, actually, in moderation. It enables a certain freedom of choice. You can walk around and choose, this or that, shopping. And it gives you a certain freedom from slavery. And I've researched the history of coins. They were invented in ancient Greece, in Lydia, in the Turkish sort of coast with the Aegean, about 600-700 BC, and they were made in temples. They were a religious thing for the community. They were stamped with a goddess, Artemis or Hera or whatever, and what it meant is you were now admitted to the civilized society. Having gone to the temple for the prayers service, you were given a coin in exchange for being there, and then you could receive some of the sacrifice. You could get something in return for it from the temple storehouse, like some oil or whatever you needed at home. And so it was a way that the temples were able to manage the distribution of the surplus. It's very interesting if you look at ancient economics and the origin of coinage. I think it was a good thing. But these Pol Pot people didn't agree, and they abolished it. And it led to the absolute catastrophic meltdown of the economy. And that's why 2 million people, the exact figures have never been established, at least 1.5 to 2 million people, were then, they either died of starvation or they were shot or tortured or bludgeoned to death. Philip Short says most of them weren't bludgeoned to death, they just died of ill health and starvation because of the economy falling apart. But there were torture chambers. There was an infamous prison in Phnom Penh where tens of thousands of people were tortured to death. It's now a museum. So what happened to my dear Cambodian culture, which was a Buddhist culture before this? And ironically, Pol Pot was himself Buddhist. All his cadres were. They were all Buddhists. And he was cremated and given a Buddhist funeral by his widow when he died. A sort of twist at the end. The only reason the Pol Pot regime fell was because the Vietnamese were annoyed that they were trying to encroach into Vietnam, and the Vietnamese had defeated America and had a very strong army, so they just said to hell with that, and they invaded Cambodia and got rid of this foul regime. And by the way, there was an interesting aside in the Philip Short lecture. The chap who was then the head of CND in London, in Britain, was a Scottish economist called Malcolm something or other, Gladwell, I think. He, like many sort of Western Marxist intellectuals who didn't know what was going on, he loved the idea of what the Cambodians were doing. He thought, great, they're doing a proper revolution. And he went on a tourist sightseeing, and he met Pol Pot. And 3 hours after that meeting, he was killed. He was beaten to death and shot by order of Pol Pot, because apparently they'd had a row. I don't know, Malcolm had grumbled that he was, I don't know what. We don't know, but it's a fact. And this was a peace guy who innocently went to meet his hero, and then the hero kills him. So I just think there's a lot to learn from all this. Yes, Pol Pot's sister was a concubine to the king, part of the palace harem. So, yeah, but the tragedy is that after Vietnam invaded, they toppled Pol Pot, and he went and hid in the jungle towards the Thai border. But he wasn't killed or captured for a decade. And in fact, America switched allegiance because they hated Vietnam so much, it had defeated them, that they started supporting Pol Pot and the Cambodian Communist Party. And they tried to get the UN to sort of censure Vietnam for an invasion, which just shows how unethical these foreign policy people are, and how. So suddenly, from being a pariah, Pol Pot becomes the hero fighting back against the Vietnamese. But eventually, he ordered the assassination of people in his dwindling band of supporters, and they eventually turned on him and court-martialed him and had him executed. And he had this Buddhist funeral. One of the questions Philip Short was asked in this fascinating talk is, did the fact that Cambodia was a Buddhist society, did it lead in any way, was it a causative factor in the genocide? Because, look, lots of other countries have become Marxist or communist. They didn't do this kind of thing. Was it in any way a factor? And Philip kind of answers ish and says yes-ish, but he doesn't go into details. I was thinking about this, and I have a thesis about this, that there are two things, and I'm just a philosopher thinking aloud here. In the Buddhist if you interpret Buddhist teachings literally, that there is no soul, there is therefore essentially no metaphysical reason for anyone to have human rights, because there's nothing to have human rights with. There's no soul, there's no self. You're simply an agent of karma. That's the first point. And I think, going back to say what we were discussing about personalism and the Catholic approach and the more theistic approach, that in Christianity the individual has rights because they have an immortal soul, and you're not allowed to harm, damage, kill a person because of that. I think in Buddhism, I think some people may misinterpret the idea of no soul, anatma, to mean if I kill you, you're just a body collapsing. Doesn't matter. So that's one. I think there's something to explore there. Also, the fact that Chairman Mao was a Buddhist, he was brought up a Buddhist, and he had this same lack of respect for the individual, who don't have any rights. All that matters is the cause. The second point I want to and this is just a provocation if you want, is that since Buddhism accepts the fact of suffering, and that is the law of life, the fact that I'm suffering enormously and having to leave my home with one satchel after 24-hour notice, I'm suffering. Well, so what? Life's suffering. I'm not going to complain. It's just like normal, isn't it? It proves Buddha was right. And I just wonder if the enormous suffering that the Cambodians went through, I mean, they were doing this to themselves, to each other. And the enormous suffering the Chinese went through when they did this to themselves as well, because the same thing happened in China. Mao did massive violence against the Chinese people themselves, and with the willing instruments of his own party, and he used terror and blackmail and every trick in the book to get them to do his bidding. Well, is it because Buddhism sort of accepts the law of suffering and therefore suffering, bring it on, let's have even more, I don't know, I'm just speculating. Whereas if you start from the assumption that, I think in Christianity, that yes, there is suffering on the planet, but our job is to heal it. Christ the Messiah came to heal the suffering, to heal the sick, to bind the wounds, to help the orphan, and to help advance humanity beyond suffering. And I think Islam took that same idea. I think in Islam, a doctor is incredibly important, a healer. They're the hakim of the community. And that's why Muslims were incredibly good scientific doctors and helped spread medicine knowledge to Europe when we were sort of living in huts. So I think, I'm just thinking aloud here, that impetus to heal and not harm seems to be absent in societies which misinterpret Buddhism to mean that suffering is inevitable and the only way out of it is individual. I will reach my own enlightenment and I won't have to come back here because this world is so evil and so fallen and suffering. I want to escape. This society, Cambodia, was a Theravadan society, so it kind of believed in that personal escape from suffering. Anyway, these are huge issues, and I've been musing upon this all week. It's shocking, but do listen to that talk by Philip Short. Read the book, and if you ever get power, don't abolish money. If you're ever don't do that, please, because it causes chaos and mass slaughter. And also, please respect intellectuals, because the arrogance of the anti-intellectual mob is something that, again, was part of this tragedy. I would say people like Pol Pot, they're pseudo-intellectuals. I would say Mao and Stalin were as well. They were thugs, criminals, actually, literally. And so was Lenin, in fact, if you read the biography of these people. And they just followed the wrong teachings, the wrong interpretation of Marx, which was, of course, pointed out all those years ago by the mayor of Busak, who knew of Marx and was critical of his work because it was deterministic and scientific, and it was a false teaching. Pierre Leroux, one of the founders of, we can call it spiritual socialism or Fabian socialism, which is the kind I would support, which affords ethics into the picture. Marx got rid of ethics because if there's a deterministic law governing everything, there's no right and wrong, there's just the law. Okay, so that's some of what I've been up to, and I've also, just to say, at the moment I'm working on Catalan, which is a fascinating language. I'm in love with Catalan at the moment, which is on the border, the cusp between France and Spain, in the Pyrenees region. Pablo Casals, the great cellist, was from Catalan, and he founded a music festival in Prades, up there in the mountains, which is still going. I was taken there as a child by my mother, who took us on holiday to Collioure, and we explored those mountains. I remember us, being very impressed by it all. And I've always been in love with Catalan since I discovered the works of Raymond Lull, or Ramon Lull, as they pronounce it, the great Franciscan mystic from 13th century Mallorca. And in the Mallorcan islands, Ibiza and stuff, they speak Catalan as well. It's a language that's closer to French than to Spanish, interestingly. A lot of the words are quite similar to French, I've discovered. And Raymond Lull was one of the great intellectuals of his day, a Christian who knew about the Kabbalah, he knew about Sufism, he studied universal wisdom, and he wanted to find a universal truth beyond individual teachings, and he sought for the great art, as he called it. He invented a sort of proto-computer based on the divine names and the archetypes of God, which he recognized a plural. And he invented a kind of, a sort of wheels within wheels thing that would tell you at any one time which archetype you're talking about, like an early computer. And my late colleague, Dame Frances Yates, wrote about Raymond Lull. I think that may be where I first came across him and realised his genius. And John Dee had some of his books, of course. So I've always been fascinated by him. And he was a Mallorcan. He was proud of his Catalan language, and he wanted to reconcile all the religions of the world in one great law of peace. He had a mystical vision on Mount Rwanda, which was in the middle of Mallorca, where I've been. There is a monastery there. And anyway, just one lovely thing about Raymond Lull. I've written about him. If you're interested, read my book on the symbiosis of ideas and Andalusia, where I compared Raymond Lull's work to that of Ibn Arabi, the great Sufi, who was his near contemporary, and the Zohar, which was written by Moses de Leon around the same time. So I looked at the greatest Christian, Jewish and Muslim thinkers from Andalusia and compared and contrasted them for a UNESCO conference, which we had in Cordoba and also in Paris. And I published that subsequently. So, yes, so I think Raymond Lull is a genius who wanted world peace, and he studied everything, in order to achieve that intellectually. He was a Franciscan. And the other thing that's so fascinating, and this I love about history, is years after he died, and of course he didn't succeed in getting world peace, he tried, but years after he died, a chap in Mallorca called Fray Junipero Serra, who was a philosopher and a learned man, had studied all Lull's works, right? He was sent by the King of Spain to Mexico to be professor of philosophy at the University of Mexico, which had been going a couple of 100 years. And this chap, Junipero Serra, was just a philosopher who loved, and he was a philosopher in the tradition of Raymond Lull. There weren't that many chairs of Lullian philosophy, but he was one of them. Then a decade or so after he'd been lecturing, he was sent by the governor of Mexico to go and explore the west coast of New Mexico, and he named and discovered all the great missions like San Diego, Los Angeles, San Francisco. He planted these missions as a Catholic a missionary. I think he was a Franciscan too, all the way up the coast. And I love California. I always feel I've come home when I reach California because of its universalism, because it's where the UN was founded, and Californian mentality is like, let's do it, let's think big, you know. And that's where the Silicon Revolution came from. That's why I can talk to you on digital. That's the Californian mind. Now, I argue in my book, in my essay, that this goes back to Junipero Serra and the Lullian tradition. This search for universal truth, I think, was transmitted into the birth of California from Raymond Lull. It's just a hypothesis about how history has this interesting way of resonating, like energy vibrations that leap centuries, and then the same thing occurs. I mean, I wouldn't be surprised if, like, 400 years from now, there's a philosophy club happens here in the middle of France, and they do stuff like we're doing without even knowing we were here doing it. You know, it's quite possible that's how history works, it seems to me. So anyway, that's... Oh, and the other thing I want to say about Catalan is the word for enlightenment. I was looking up the word for enlightenment, and there's two words. One is illuminatio, like illumination. When you're illuminated, then you're enlightened. But there's another one which is very interesting, which is more like illustratio. And I was thinking, what's that got to do with enlightenment? Illustrated? Illustrations? And then I thought illustrious. And the idea of something being illustrated is that you give it pictures, you give it light, you illustrate it. And so to be enlightened means you get colour. Sorry, that's upside down. This is from the Cluny Museum, the beautiful, Lady and the Unicorn. So I think it's interesting that Catalan has retained this idea of being an illustrious person. Means you're somehow beautiful, paint-worthy. I'm still researching that. But so what I like about Catalan is it's so close to French and fairly close to Spanish and Portuguese, but it's its own thing. And it has complex language differences. And what I like about this project, the 99 Names of Peace, is by comparing and contrasting the words of peace, you get different angles. It's like shining different light on the same concepts through the different lenses. Their word for peace is Pau, P-A-U, which is also the name of a town in the Pyrenees, Pau. Okay, so that's... and then I want to say I've also been reading this very, very important book about Gaza and Israel, which is a tragedy still unfolding. Deluge, Gaza and Israel from Crisis to Cataclysm, edited by Jamie Stern Weiner, OR Books, and it's just been published a couple of weeks ago, and I ordered a copy, one of the first to come to France. It's published in New York, and it's very, very important, and it's a whole bunch of essays by both Israelis and Palestinians and, scholars of the region, talking about, why did this happen? I mean, I was talking about the genocide in Cambodia, but there's a genocide going on now in Gaza. Why? Why did nobody see it coming? Why didn't we try and stop it? We knew it might be happening. Why didn't the people in power take steps to prevent it? Could more have been done? As a peacemaker, I've set up the Truth and Reconciliation Commission for the Middle East when I've been visiting Palestine and Israel. I've never been to Gaza yet, but I've been doing my best to get dialogue going, and I've organised meetings